live, and we'll see if it works.
Meeting is now streaming on Facebook.
Oh, there it is. Okay. It tells us we're live on Facebook, so I'm going to believe it. All right, and it's 7 o'clock, so that tells me we're getting started. Okay. So welcome to our illustrious panel, and welcome to everyone joining us on Facebook. We are here to talk about housing justice, and I'm Elizabeth. The past few panels, I have completely forgotten to introduce myself, so I'm going to rectify that. I'm the executive director of the Boston Faith and Justice Network, and since the summer, we've been putting on these uncomfortable conversations, thus named because we're trying to convene conversations around issues that are incredibly important, but sometimes they're issues that we don't want to talk about because they're issues that are around things that are not the easiest things to talk about, whether it's because we don't know where to start or because we don't possess the expertise or because they touch on things that are difficult to articulate. And that's why we bring people like our awesome panel today to help us start those conversations, to help us understand things that are sometimes difficult for us to understand. So I am going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what it is they do in the area of housing and housing justice and why it is that they agreed to be part of this panel. So I'm going to ask you guys to just tell us who you are and what you do and just really briefly why you wanted to be part of this panel. I mean, I definitely asked you and a little bit begged you, but why you think this conversation is important. And then we'll dive into some of the questions. So John, you are to my left on my little Zoom. So I'm going to ask you to start.
All right, thank you. My name is John Lane, and I work in a few different facets of being around people who are experiencing homelessness. I work in the city shelters between the main women's and men's shelter and other satellite shelters. And I am ministry partner at Common Cathedral, which is a church that meets outside every Sunday on the Boston Common and is a church primarily for and of people experiencing homelessness. And I also am a ministry partner and on Cathedral chapter at St. Paul's and part of the MANA program, which is an indoor program that is also directed primarily at people who are on the streets. In MANA's case, primarily people who do not stay in shelters, but are often the people you see sleeping outside in the downtown Boston area, around the Common, downtown Boston Government Center, Copley, that area. And then there are some other smaller organizations that work with homeless individuals that I work with on very ad hoc basis for just, events or what have you. And then, of course, I'm an ambassador for the Winter Walk, which just took place yesterday, which is the walk in Greater Boston to bring attention to the issue of homelessness and people who are experiencing it in Boston and the Greater Boston area. And the reason this is such a near and dear thing to me and kind of consumes most of my waking hours is because for about 5.5 years, I was chronically homeless in Boston. I was out on Long Island Shelter when that was the primary shelter. When the bridge came down, I spent a little bit of time at that gym that was going on. And then when they opened 112 Southampton, which is the main men's shelter, I was there for a few months until I got housed. And I now live in Boston Housing Authority property here in Charlestown. So, in addition to being concerned about folks who are, looking for housing, I'm very concerned, even on a personal level, about folks who are in public housing and, affordable housing, because I'm one of them, and that affects not just all the people that I deal with on a daily basis, but myself and my neighbors and the people I see every day, in my neighborhood. So that is me. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much. And we're happy to have you. And now I'm going to ask Kathy, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're here?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I was glad to accept the invitation. So my name's Kathy Mercado, and I am the associate director of a small nonprofit, literally really small. There's only 3 of us, but we pack a punch. We focus on, our mission is sustainable home ownership, right? So we try to, get first generational home buyers into homes, people that maybe never thought of owning a home in their lifetime, probably lived in their home or public housing a lifetime, generations, that generational wealth gap that we keep talking about. That's our mission. So basically my thing is home ownership, bringing people up, crossing those boundaries, making this thing possible. So yeah, home ownership is what we do here in Lowell.
Awesome. Thank you. So glad to have you here with us. And Al, will you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're here, why you agreed to be on the panel with us?
First, I want to thank Elizabeth and the Boston Faith and Justice Network for inviting me to take part in this conversation. My name is Al Ewing. I'm the director of the Chelsea Housing Authority. I've been at the Housing Authority for 21 years, the first 10 years as a director of resident selection. And I've been the executive director since 2011. The CHA has a staff of 40 employees, an annual budget of about $22 million, and is the largest landlord in the city of Chelsea, with 914 units of state and federal housing in our 8 developments. In addition, we have about 806 vouchers where we subsidize the rents for people living in private units, such as Section 8 vouchers or the Massachusetts rental voucher program, or the what we call HVP, and that's for disabled people who are under the age of 60. And then we have VASH vouchers, which are for homeless veterans. Okay. I also serve on the International Research and Global Exchange Committee for the National Association of Redevelopment Officials, which is otherwise known as NARO. That's our organization, where issues on affordable housing is shared through visits, white papers, and conferences with other countries, such as Canada, Australia, South Africa, and others. And you'll find we have the same problems all over the world, just not enough affordable housing. And so we share that information. Okay. So I'm here tonight because I think, again, it's important. Housing affects every, city and town. It affects every individual. And that's why it's so important to have this discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you. I am so thankful for each of you guys being here. I know I've probably been gushing over you as we met before the panel. You each bring something unique and different, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from every one of you. So I want to invite everybody who's here with us on Facebook. If you guys have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat, or whatever it's called on Facebook, if you want to ask questions, and we'll get to those at the end. The way we're going to work is I'm going to ask each of our panelists a question that's sort of unique to their specific area of expertise, and we'll go through that and then have some general questions at the end. Before we get into that, I do just want to say this panel is almost exclusively because of our wonderful board member, Dira, who works in the Chelsea Housing Authority with Al. And I'm just so grateful for the ways in which she's taught me and has helped me put this panel together. So thank you to Dira. And so we're going to start this panel with John again. And I just want to ask you, you already started us off a little bit in the introduction. Can you share a little bit about your personal experience with homelessness and how that kind of shapes what you do now?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Elizabeth. I became homeless in Boston in 2010. And I am probably not the typical person who ends up homeless, and I also am. And it's very interesting when you kind of think about the individual stories of people experiencing homelessness. I came from very stable family, went to school, lived in suburban Connecticut, came to Boston, went to BU, graduated from BU. I did not distinguish myself there, but I graduated. And ended up getting a job and working my way up. I was at a couple of companies, ended up at a company in Cambridge, and was there for 9 years, and I worked myself up to a pretty decent level. Was living in Cambridge at the time, and just through a change in ownership of the company and a job change, I lost that job. And at that point, by that point, I was what would be called, although I don't really like the term, a functional alcoholic. And you can maintain, but when things get big and broken, it's a lot harder to rebuild when you are in active addiction. And so I rebuilt, but smaller and smaller and smaller, and pretty soon I ended up not being able to even keep a minimum wage physical labor job. Couldn't even keep a rooming house room. And so after a number of years going through all my savings and such, and I finally got to the point where I just wasn't welcome anywhere. I was unemployable, and I ended up on Long Island. First at the Long Island shelter, and then through Pine Street at Pine Street Anchor In program. And that is where, at that program, I finally, after a few years, applied for housing, and applied for BHA and for state programs, and BHA was the one that came in first. But it took me about 3 years to break through the just sort of inertia and depression, and certainly my addiction, to even apply. And then it took about almost 2 years to get housing. It's a very long process, and it's a process that requires you to be your own best advocate, which is very difficult at times for folks who are experiencing all the issues that surround being homeless. I whenever I talk to a group of people, I say, for someone who's never been homeless, I can give you one example that makes it go click in your mind. Imagine everything you do all day long, every day, is waiting in line at the DMV. You want to get a meal, you're in line. You want to get on a bus, you got to wait in line. Now you got to wait to get back to the shelter. You want to get your towel, you got to wait in line to get a towel. You want to get your sheets, you got to wait. It's every single thing you do is the line at the DMV, and it's just getting through your day is an occupation. And so with all those issues, it does take a lot to get out. And the case managers are wonderful. They're phenomenal, both the city, Pine Street, other organizations, but they're just overwhelmed, and the difficulties of getting in touch with folks and finding folks once the initial connection is made is just very difficult. So it takes a long time. And when I got out, I was housed. I got this place where I now live in Charlestown, and I'm thankful and grateful to get it. But I didn't really have any support or community, so I was still in active addiction. And I didn't really have any ability to make myself employable. I just now had basically a free or very low rent house to live in. And what finally really did it for me was I found a church community that gave me sort of community and support, and that place to be and the place to make mistakes, but also to grow, and to, most importantly in my case, get sober and to stay sober. We don't like to actually use the name of the organization that many of us use, but it's near the beginning of the phone book, and many people know of it. But it is for me, and I think for many people, the numbers for people who are experiencing homelessness, certainly people who are adults without dependents, and certainly I would say families in economic crisis and families with dependents fleeing domestic violence is a branch I know nothing about. But for individual people without dependents experiencing homelessness, there's a lot of mental illness and a huge amount of substance abuse disorder. And that supportive concept of housing plus, housing first and then housing plus, is what can make people successful and make people go from a situation where I was completely and utterly useless to society, or myself or anyone else, to a place where you can be productive and useful and contribute and give back. And I think that is why now that I've gained this experience that I certainly never asked for in the beginning, it's become sort of what I want to do in every direction of my life, is to sort of trumpet the stories of the people who are experiencing it. It is amazing, the uh, diversity of backgrounds and diversity of experiences of people who are experiencing homelessness, and also then work for solutions, things like supportive housing and national solutions, and um, also just making sure that folks who get housed, who find their way into public housing or Section 8, or find their way into even beyond that home ownership, um, then have the resources they need to weather, a short-term dysfunction or downturn or loss of job or illness or something like that, so that we aren't creating a system, we don't have to continue to create this system where people are falling into homelessness. But when we move folks out, or we keep them out of homelessness in the first place. So that is who I am, and where where I come down, and why I do the work that I do.
Thank you. I think you covered a lot of things in that, and you touched on a lot of really important stuff that those of us who are new to this conversation don't know a lot about, like supportive housing, and understanding what that is. So thank you for introducing those ideas. I'm going to ask Kathy a question now. You are below me. I'm always fascinated by the Zoom things. I feel like we're the Brady Bunch. Kathy, you talked a little bit about what you do and what you're passionate about. So can you expand on that a little bit? You talked about home ownership is what your organization does and what you're passionate about. Can you expand on what it is you do and how you do it, and why you think that's so important to housing justice specifically, like why that's a justice issue?
It's a just, well, I mean, I can read something that I came across. So what is the racial wealth gap, right? So, I mean, this is significant wealth inequalities in the United States, and that's just been throughout history. Even when our veterans used to come back from war, they didn't get the same, they weren't able to get a loan to buy a home. I mean, there's just been inequalities and wealth gap in regards to home ownership. Now, for generations, my family, when they came here, we all lived in public housing. It's easy to conform and to stay where you're at. It's harder to fight your way out the system, right? And no one really gives you those tools to get out of that systematic, system that's in place. So, my mom was a young mom. I was a young mom. I made it my mission to make sure that my children had a home that they can call their own. And that was important to me. Home ownership was very important, so that when she became of age, if she wanted to buy a home, that she was able to buy a home. And I can say today, and I can also say, John, just to piggyback, and I have no problem sharing my true story. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm proud of it. When I was 17 years old, I was homeless as well. So I can relate to you 100%. My mom lived in public housing. You can have so many people in public housing, right? There's so many rules and regulations and all these things, right, that are in place for people that probably never lived in public housing their whole life, right? So I was with child, and, I had my daughter young. I was a single mom, homeless, and I fought my way through homelessness to home ownership. Now, if I was able to do that, I wanted to be an inspiration for others, for single people, for young mothers, for young fathers, just across the board, for people of all backgrounds, all races. Because one of the biggest issues in our society, we have a lot of issues, right? But we're, little by little, it's not a quick fix. But one of the biggest thing is income inequalities, right? So income injustice, I mean, just classism and all of that, right away you're judged, you're prejudged, and no one's really giving you those tools to succeed. Now, I love to share my story with people. I love to motivate them. I'm a big believer in Section 8 to home ownership, using your voucher to become a homeowner. I mean, a lot of housing authorities do use this program, like the city of Lowell. They do have a home ownership program where, you know, they help you instead of, they'll help you pay a portion of your mortgage payment, just like they would if you were renting an apartment, but for 15 years. Now, if someone's disabled, then they'll help you for the life of the loan. You know, they'll help you pay a portion of that. So you can, you know, if you wanted to buy a home, you can use your voucher towards that. And that's something that I wish other housing authorities would adapt. I mean, you know, everyone has different things and not every housing authority has the same problems, but it's something that I'm really passionate about and that I would love to promote. But yes, homeownership is my purpose. If I was homeless, I can do it. And just to give even more inspiration, my oldest daughter is 25 years old and she just bought her home last year. So that is housing equality, right? That's the true story.
That is exciting. Good for her. So just following up, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but if you want to expand or can expand, what obstacles do you see as you work with people to achieve home ownership? What are the main obstacles you see that you can help people through, or you say, this is what I'm having struggle to help people through?
You know, so there's down payment assistance programs. For instance, one of the biggest things that I struggle with right now is if someone applies for down payment assistance and it's through home funds and it's a HUD funded, it's a federal grant, and municipalities can use this funds for different things. And one of the things that Lowell has done, Lowell's a huge, they advocate for home ownership opportunities, but they also have to follow HUD regulations. I wish that there was, you know, less of the regulations and more of let's help these people. Let's not make it so complicated for people to get these funds in order to achieve home ownership. So that's one of the things that I wish that we could work more towards. Also policy, right? So, you know, there's something that a lot of people talk about in this industry of home ownership is the policy where, you know, if they pass some type of law where they would charge a service fee to fund, you know, home ownership education, that would be huge because we wouldn't have to be fighting and we could actually, you know, looking for grants here and there because they're really underfunded, right? So if we didn't have to look for funding everywhere and fight, just even a service fee for every closing in the United States to fund these type of programs, that will help us be able to help more people become homeowners, right? So that's a policy change and that's an obstacle. One of the other obstacles is just when people have been told that they're not able to do something, like pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? We were talking about that earlier in the group. You know, it's not that easy. Like I said before, it would have been easy for me to stay where I was at instead of fighting to where I wanted to go, right? So educating people and telling them, no, you can do this. Most people are paying 70% of their income towards rent, right? If they're not in an affordable unit. And that's a fact. And even in public housing, people have that mindset, oh, well, you live in public housing and you must be paying $20 for rent. That's not true. Most people that live in public housing, they have to pay a portion. I mean, I'm not a housing expert. I only worked in the housing authority in Lowell when I was 13. It was my first job. Maybe that's why I ended up here too. But a lot of people pay a lot. I mean, I've seen people where they're paying less when they purchased a home versus when they were paying an affordable unit. And you see that even more and more with the increase. So we need to get down payment assistance. We need more people to support down payment assistance programs and support like Mass Housing Partnership, Mass Housing, those type of programs as well.
Great, thank you. That's, again, so many things that as I'm a new student understanding housing justice, it's just really helpful to understand some of these programs that I wasn't aware of and to really think about the importance of home ownership as just one of the pieces of housing justice that honestly, like I hadn't considered, being someone who comes from a position of privilege. And, oh, some people own houses, some people don't. Like, honestly, just hadn't processed that. And just to confess my own, like, this is where I'm coming from. And so I'm just, again, so thankful that we're having this discussion and can really, like, you guys are just willing to break it down for me, and I'm just really thankful. Al, can you talk? When you and I spoke, I was really thankful for you. You basically gave me a primer on public housing, and I was just really thankful for the ways in which you explained it. And I think it's important for us to understand just the position public housing plays in terms of housing justice, and the how it serves the community. And you also talked about some of the challenges and some of the innovations. And so I would love it if you could talk about some of those.
Okay. Okay. First, I just wanted to say that John and Kathy both have very compelling stories. And of course, we deal with both of them in public housing. We have a number of people come to us who are previously homeless. And as John said, it's not often just one problem of being homeless. It's usually multiple issues. Sometimes there's also substance abuse involved, people being victims of domestic violence. So it's not often just one problem. It's sometimes a multiple problems that have to be addressed. And as Kathy mentioned, the importance of home ownership. That's why we do have a family self-sufficiency program at our housing authority in Chelsea. Whereas, over a period of 5 years, people can put any increases that they have in their salaries from their jobs. And that money can go towards job training or starting a business or, down payment for a home and those types of things. So that certainly is important also. But I think it's important to understand public housing overall and how it works. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the 351 cities and towns here, 242 of them have public housing authorities that have been established. For instance, our housing authority was established in Chelsea back in 1946. So this year we're celebrating our 75th anniversary of serving the city of Chelsea with housing. And those 242 public housing authorities throughout the Commonwealth vary in size from some as small as having 10 units of housing to those that have over 20,000 plus units of housing. Some of the largest cities such as Boston. Each housing authority in Massachusetts has a 5-member board, and they're either elected by the town if it's a town, or if it's a city, they're usually appointed by the mayor, 4 slots, and then 1 is appointed by the governor. And every board by law has to have a tenant as a board member. So each of them have one of their tenants must be fill one of those 5 slots. Okay. And we're very fortunate here in Massachusetts because Massachusetts is one of only 4 states in the country that actually have state-funded public housing. That's Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and Hawaii. All other housing, no matter where you go in the country, it's all federal housing, federally funded housing through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development. But in Massachusetts, we have 43,000 state public housing units. That's a portfolio worth over $12 billion. We have 3,500 state rental assistance vouchers that have been issued through those housing authorities. And those 3,500 state rental assistance vouchers, they work similar to a Section 8, but they're usually not as lucrative. People have to pay up to 40% of their income, and the fair market rents might be lower than they are in the Section 8 program. But there are a number of them that do help, and they can only be used in Massachusetts, okay? In addition to the 43,000 state public housing units that we have, there's another 38,000 of federal public housing units, okay? And 55,000 federal rental assistance vouchers, or what as Section 8 vouchers. Okay? Now, the thing about that is that there's about 120 housing authorities that actually issue Section 8 vouchers in Massachusetts. Of those 120, 100 of them are on a centralized wait list. And what that means, if you are looking for Section 8 voucher, you only need to apply once to one of those 100 housing authorities, and you're on the wait list of all 100 communities. So that just saves you from running around from city to city trying to apply for a Section 8 voucher. So that would put you on about 100. However, as I mentioned, there's 55,000 vouchers in the state, and the waiting list for a Section 8 voucher is over 200,000 people. So do the math, that's the problem, is that one of the things that, to understand today is that the need is so much greater than the resources that are available. Okay? I know in Chelsea and in most communities, most people will wait about 10 years to receive a Section 8 voucher. Some certainly could get it sooner because of certain priorities or preferences, but on average, it's going to be about a 10-year wait. And housing authorities are the only agency mandated by state law to give priority to veterans and homeless. Basically, housing authorities are municipal corporations. They were, as I mentioned, established by vote. And they get a lot of support from their towns. They'll donate land, buildings, resources, and services to the authority because they serve local seniors. Well, 2/3 of our portfolio is for local seniors. You'll see senior housing in most communities. And then the other third is for families, disabled, and veterans, as I mentioned before. We get our funding through both sources, both HUD and DHCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the state regulatory agencies, and they give us an operating subsidy. That operating subsidy is the cost of what it takes for us to run the developments minus the rents that we're able to collect from the tenants. And the tenants pay anywhere between 25 and 32% of their income towards the rent, depending on the program and whether their utilities are included or not. So it varies, but roughly on average, you can say about 30% of the rent that they're going to pay. And then we receive capital funds from both sources. And that's based on the formula. And that is so that we can, do things like repair roofs and replace roofs and elevators and things such as that. But again, there's a backlog of capital funds that are needed to keep these buildings up to the level that they should be at. But one thing I want to tell you is that local housing authorities are really the state's most cost-effective housing for low-income people. Okay? The average subsidy that we receive currently is about $140 per unit per month. The cost of someone being in a shelter is about $3,000 a person per month for us to hire these hotels and shelters to rent. So again, it costs you $3,000. And then the long-term care in a nursing home averages $10,750 per person per month. Okay. So this whole thing of trying to allow seniors to age in place is very important because it saves the state millions of dollars. Gone are the days whereas public housing authorities just leased units and collected rents. Today, supportive services is such a big part of what we have to do. That's why, we have partnerships with Mystic Valley Elder Services and North Suffolk Mental Health, Mass General Hospital, Chelsea Senior Center, Chelsea Public Schools, Chelsea Police Department, and a host of community and nonprofits. So today it's definitely more complicated, just in terms of housing people, and there just is not sufficient resources. Okay, we have waiting lists that take years for people to get housing, and that's why it's so important to support affordable housing.
That was so much. Thank you, Al. And I swear I heard a lot of things and I took a bunch of notes, but I really had a hard time getting past 10 years, the 10-year wait. I was like, what? Wow. And I think you had even told me that before, like, honestly, the first time we spoke, but I just, wow.
But and this is important. Even when I say that, some people get housed in a short period of time because of priorities or preferences that they may have. Others, it will take longer.
Right.
But what I would say to people, it's really important to apply for housing, apply for all of the programs that you can, okay? And people will call me up and say, how long does it take to get housing? And they haven't even applied. I said, forever if you don't apply. So,
Right.
you know, you'd be surprised how time goes, and, you know, and you might come up sooner in another city or town. So,
Yeah.
so please apply.
Yeah. And that's great. That's great to remind people and to understand that it will never happen if you don't apply. And even if it sounds so daunting, and I'm sure the process is, but it's there and the help is there. I'm going to move on to some general questions, and, you know, anyone can jump in and answer them, and more than one of you guys can answer them. Cause again, you guys each bring such different areas of expertise and knowledge. I'm so thankful that you're here. How has gentrification impacted the populations you work with, and what, if anything, can be done to mitigate that?
Mhm. Well, I know that, you know, I grew up in Cambridge, and, you know, now everyone that I grew up in Cambridge, no one can afford to live there, basically. My youngest son is still there because he has a family home there. So he was fortunate. But, you know, again, if you don't own a family home there, it's very hard for someone to get into a community like Cambridge because it's just so expensive with the schools there. And I see the same thing happening in other communities now, Somerville, and now even in Chelsea, because of the proximity to the city of Boston. One of the things we're doing now is we have a state development of 96 units of family housing, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. We're looking to tear that down and to replace it with 330 units of mixed income units that will have the 96 public housing units will be replaced 1 for 1. We will add 40 more workforce units that go up to 120% of the area mean income. And then the 194 units at market rate. Those market rate units will be used to help subsidize those public housing units. And this will be a contract for 99 years, a ground lease for 99 years, so that those families will be able to stay there in a beautiful new building with all the amenities. There's no rich door, poor door. You know, everyone will have the same benefits of living there, and that will help fight gentrification. These kinds of, you know, affordable housing programs, if they're structured correctly, then I think that they could be a win-win for everyone. You know, we started this process, I started this back in 2015. We expect to break ground probably sometime in the fall, early fall this year. So, but it's a process, and again, we will do that because it will allow those 96 families to remain in Chelsea, and that's important. So it's also important to not only create new affordable housing, but to preserve the affordable housing that we have, because a lot of these houses that you see that were built with tax credits, they run out after 40 years or some other period of time, 30 years. A lot of them are coming due now. And so we're losing a lot of housing. So it's also trying to preserve it, where people need to be active and advocate for that also.
Can I just, I wish I could clone you, Al, and bring you to Lowell. I wish I could do that. I want a page from that playbook. It's 2015 you started that program. That's exactly, because other than home ownership, I am an advocate for housing in general and housing justice. And I just want to say, wow, that just made my eyes tear up, because literally I'm so passionate about it. And you hit the, what do you call that? That nail, whatever that saying is. But I'm not good at metaphors. The fact that 120% AMI, area medium income, that's a huge factor in regards to housing that's affordable, because a lot of working families. So for instance, one thing that I run into a lot is the 80% AMI. So most programs, if you're above 80% AMI, you don't qualify for certain, lottery properties or housing or any of that. And if you think about it, just simple math, if you have a family of 2 adults with no children, one person's making $20 an hour, the other one's making $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, they're over income for the 80% AMI. It just, the math doesn't make sense. So the fact that you said that the other 120 units, I think you said, was 120%. AMI?
40 units. 40,
40
40
units.
additional.
So 40 of the units, 100%, 128% AMI, which is great because those are still units that are affordable. And then the mix of people with market rent, you have a mixture, no poor door, no rich door, just the same level, right? And that's so important because when you mix all types of community together, that's where you get rid of the biggest problem in our society, right? Rich versus poor, economics versus this. My child can play with you because they live in public housing and I live in the suburbs. Thank you. It was amazing to hear that. It gives me hope.
Al, you are describing my exact life. I live in the Charlestown development, which is 1,100 some odd units, and we have been. Matter of fact, the zoning board just approved the project here. It's going to be 2,700 units. All 1,100 or so of the public housing units will be kept, but it's going to be in a massive, 2,700 apartments, all spread through the however many, 8 blocks by 6 blocks area down here by the foot of the bridge, the Tobin Bridge in Charlestown. However, what you said, 2015 resonated. I was housed here. I got my housing in October of 2015 with the information coming in that this was happening. It's 2021. And I know COVID has slowed things down, but COVID didn't happen, 6 years ago. So it's been coming and coming and coming. It just, these projects, as big as they are, they're fantastic, but they take a long time. And some of the sort of regulatory hurdles that are there, from a policy standpoint, trimming some of those down would be huge, to get these things happening faster. Because what you're talking about, that 10-year wait, and I know that it isn't true for everyone, but when you just hear that number, you're like, well, yeah, maybe I'll throw my application in, but I'm not going to, rigorously follow up on it. And it if I move, if I change my phone number, if I do whatever, my application gets lost, and if I'm not paying attention to it, the next person in line who is gets moved up. So I think if whatever the governmental policy could be, not the policies of the actual housing authorities, but sort of the overarching governments and the municipalities in the Commonwealth, that to cut down the hurdles that they're putting in the way to make this happen a little quicker. That would be huge. And I echo what Kathy said about gentrification completely. This mixed unit, it will make it for a nicer place here. The quality of the units of the housing stock will improve, but it will be all income levels having that. I can speak to another project that I am aware of and that I know is going through the zoning process, which is, in sort of one of my loves of supportive housing. The 140 Clarendon project, which is the building across, kitty corner across from the Hancock Tower. It's the YWCA headquarters. It's a 12-story historic building. And there is a company that is trying to just buy that from the Y. The Y is trying to sell that building and turn it into 210 affordable units, 90 of which will be supportive housing managed by Pine Street, with Pine Street case managers there. And of course, if you think of the neighborhood, that's Copley Square. That's about as expensive a neighborhood as you're going to get. And all of these units will be for extraordinarily low income people, either 30%, the Section 8 eligible chronic homeless units, the 90%, or the 90 units, and then the other 120 are all 60 AMI. However, as you mentioned, it's different per municipality, and 60% of AMI in the middle of all of those high rises in, Back Bay and along the skyscraper spine, as it were, of Boston, is a much higher figure than it would be in some of the other places. So, there are so many wonderful projects going on, but it just does seem like they take quite a long time to move through the process.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, John. They do, and I know for the last about 3 years, the governor had been pushing to some legislation through in his housing choice voucher program, which would certainly get rid of some of those impediments to development. For instance, cities and towns need to get a vote of their, city councils, and they needed a supermajority for the zoning to take place. And just this past budget, it did finally get that through, so that then it'll just take a simple majority, and that's been an impediment. And the thing about it is, there are people who are against development of any kind in some of these cities and towns, especially when you say affordable housing. And so they use a lot of delay tactics. And by delaying a project, you can kill the project because it just gets more and more expensive to do this project. When we would started ours, we were talking about $95 million. Our project is close to $140 million now in order to do it. And so those delays can be very damaging, and that's important. So, and that's where people, members of the Boston Faith and Justice Network can help by getting involved in organizations such as CHAPA. I sent information over to Elizabeth, so I'm sure she'll pass that out. But an agency like that really advocates for affordable housing throughout the state. They give out a lot of good information and training courses and things that will, give people an idea of what's happening and when you need to contact your legislators to support some of these changes that need to be made. And that's what people could do, something very positive and specific that will have an impact on some of these issues. And just one more point I wanted to make. We were talking about all these numbers we're throwing around about AMI, average mean income, and all that. The low income is 80% being 80% of that number. And we have very low income is 50% of that number. Extremely low income is 30% of that number. And clearly over 95% of my residents fall into that extremely low income. So when you talk about public housing, you're talking about people from that 0 to that 30% mostly who are in housing. And a lot of them are at 0, in which case they don't pay rent. So, you can go all the way down to 0. And, public housing agencies are the only ones that actually deal with that segment of our population. Affordable housing goes all the way up to 80%. They're usually working from that 60 to that 80% band. Okay. When you go beyond the 80% band to that 120, it's called workforce housing. And that's for people who generally are like school teachers and city employees and policemen, firemen, all those, even with 2-income families, they fall into that range. So, so affordable housing just affects a lot of people today.
It's helpful stuff. It introduces a whole other range of equity issues that would be like 6 more panels that we need to have. So I'm getting ideas, but that's a really helpful answer from all of you guys. Thank you. I want to talk about the pandemic and just ask what, I don't want to say what, if any, because I'm just going to assume there's been a significant impact on all of the ways in which you guys interact with different populations. And so just, can you talk a little bit about what impact you've seen, if you anticipate it's a short-term impact, a long-term impact, and how you're dealing with that, or whatever ways in which you want to kind of digest that that impact that you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's had a real impact on the housing authority. I would say that. We're trying to do things. We're learning to do business differently, just as everyone else, just as we're doing now with a Zoom call. We're learning to work remotely, through the mail and through emails. And, now we have robocalls to our residents to keep them informed. We've had to do all the social distancing, shut down our community rooms. We're seeing more mental health issues, in the developments. In the community of Chelsea, we've had a large number of people who have become unemployed because they, a lot of 67% of the population is Hispanic and works in the service industry. And a lot of those jobs went away, or if they were still there, they were at risk of catching the virus. So we had a lot of, that's why Chelsea was at one time the epicenter of the state in terms of the virus. Okay, so it's had an impact. One thing that I would say is for our residents, though, because of the way public housing works, is that if they lost their incomes, they could come to us and we will lower their rent all the way down to zero if necessary. But in those people in the city of Chelsea who aren't in public housing, they don't have their luxury. They have landlords who need that rent. They got to pay their mortgages. And so even though there's a moratorium going on now, it's going to be a major impact when it gets lifted, because a lot of people are going to owe a lot of rent, okay, to people. I mean, we've had some people too that have, taken advantage of that because they think that you're not going to have to pay it. So, we'll have our cases to deal with. But I'm really concerned about what's going to happen in the private sector, because a lot of people are going to lose their housing. And, we're trying to work with, other, landlords, and hoping that they'll be willing to, enter into repayment agreements with their tenants, and give them, time to pay and, work things out. So hopefully they'll do that. And that's what something like the RAF program is helpful, and that's been expanded to help deal with some of these issues. So, but I do believe that it's going to be long-term, period. It's going to have a long-term impact. We're collecting less rents. That affects the state's budget. It will definitely have a long-term impact.
John or Kathy, you guys you don't have to jump in, but do you have any ways in which you've seen it affect your communities?
Well, I can speak for Boston, for the population of folks experiencing homelessness. It was, as much as the bridge going down in 2014, this was a cataclysmic event. It's really darn hard to, shelter at home when you don't have one. People who live in shelters are like, you just can't social distance. It's 2 feet between, 2.5 feet between bunk beds. And the men's shelter on regular non-COVID times is somewhere in the neighborhood of 466 people in it, not counting staff at any given night. And so I know that back in April, Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, Dr. Jim O'Connell, who is the founder and executive director, chief executive officer, I don't know the exact title, but basically the street saint who created Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. They did a sort of abstract at Pine Street, and they just grabbed everybody who was there one night, and they did a test to see who is, everyone COVID tested. I think it was like 37% of the people there were positive. And it was kind of weird because very few of them were symptomatic. And so they were passing it back, on and on and on and on, because none of them were sick, which is kind of counterintuitive, because you would think that a population with so many comorbidities as the homeless population has, that they would be at high risk. But there is also the fact that when you're exposed to as many different things because of the situation that folks living in shelters are exposed to, that maybe your resistance builds up a little bit. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't quite know what the truth of that might be, but it was huge. And, things like Pine Street opening up the Best Western, the Comfort Inn just opened up with 50 more rooms. The Charles River Hotel now houses 100 people. 1515 Com Ave, the old Kindred Hospital, is an 84 bed shelter now for men in a housing project. Suffolk Dorm, during the initial few months, opened up. So there were lots of different city and non-governmental organization partnerships from private organizations, everybody trying to sort of do everything they could in every realm, just like in every other facet of our society. But yeah, it has been, and the other thing is, for all of these programs, every housing authority, every nonprofit that works with housing, everybody's working remotely and everybody's working like crazy, but remote isn't quite as effective as, being in the office, because you've got to drop off documents. Well, how do I get them? It just, all the logistics to that. So it has impacted us in a way that, certainly in Boston, like, if it wasn't for the bridge, we would never have had an event like this. 750 shelter and program beds closing in 4 hours kind of tends to be your, worst day in your life. But COVID is definitely a real close second.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that we've gotten from people watching with us. The first one is for Al. What resources and services are offered to people in the meantime who are waiting for units to become available and to keep people from homelessness as the only option?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, even when we have people that applied housing with us, we also give them other resources. We tell them, try to fill themselves with everything that may be available. There is Mass Housing has a document that lists subsidies that are project-based, that happen to be with the development. So it listed in there all the cities and towns that have had affordable housing units built, and they keep their own waiting lists. So a lot of people just think about the city and public housing, but there are a lot of subsidized programs out there, and a lot of subsidized buildings, for instance. So in those cases, they keep their own waiting lists, and we would suggest that people apply to those, and in the cities and towns that they're interested in living in, because they got to do that individually. And it will tell them whether it's for elderly or disabled or families. So we'll tell the criteria for that. And we encourage them to do that also.
I was muted. Thank you. Another person asked, are there any cooperative housing initiatives in the greater Boston area that you were aware of, and this is for any of you, or faith-based partners working on building new supportive or affordable housing? I feel like we've touched on a little bit, some different organizations doing some work, but are there any specific ones you want to call attention to or work? I know, John, you talked about specific housing units going up, but are there any other projects or work that you want to call attention to and say, this is what's going on? This is an organization doing some work.
There are smaller projects constantly, and then Boston's just so, by definition of its scope, that whenever a building is put up, a certain percentage has to be affordable. Sometimes the developer just puts money in a sort of pot. And the city uses that money to build more affordable housing, sometimes in public housing, sometimes in just sort of those affordable ranges that we've been talking about. The big non-governmental organization player at the moment is Pine Street. And I always joke, I work for their competitor. I work for the city shelter, not Pine, but obviously we're not competition. But Pine Street actually has more residential properties, more housing stock units than they have beds. They have more people every night housed in their apartments than they do with the shelters. And they're always looking to increase, to add more, primarily through Paul Sullivan Housing, which is their housing unit. They are huge. They're a huge organization doing uncalculable good every year. And I have to give a shout out to the Boston Housing Authority. From my experience, they are, as I said, I live in a place with 1,100 units. There are one receptionist, 3 worker, housing case managers, and 1 supervisor for this development. That's 5 people, 1,100 units, and we all have to meet with them at least once a year to come in and sign the documents and bring everything in. And if you just do the numbers, that's if everybody showed up exactly at the right time with the appointment with the right document, it's doable. It's tough, but it's doable. But that's not how life works. And so, they go out of their way as they do incredible work. And I'm sure that at Al's agency, it's the same thing. It's just that, with the need being as great as it is, there's so many applications that people are just, you spin so many plates, but there's only so many you can keep up at the air at the same time. And it really is stuff that has to be done on a legislative, governmental way. The partnerships are fantastic. The NGOs are great. The quasi-governmental agencies are phenomenal, but it really has to be done through legislation to radically change the system.
Yeah, and I want to say that I'm not aware of any specific cooperative programs, but the development that John lives in, that's being developed from 1,100 to 2,700 units, is being done by Joseph J. Cochran Company, who's the same developer that we have here in Chelsea. Now, these projects are a little bit different because in yours there are Section 8s involved and all of that. Ours was done through a feasibility grant from the Department of Housing Community Development. They gave out 2 of these grants, one to Somerville and one to Chelsea. And they wanted to see a feasibility of, building onto state lands and how we could do it without utilizing a limited amount of subsidy. So our project has it's not a tax credit deal. That's how most of these deals are done throughout the country, period. Ours is strictly some capital funding from the state, and then the rest of it is private funding. And that's a key thing because we're hoping that if we are successful with this, and it looks like we have all the funding in place now, we plan on breaking ground, that we could duplicate this in other parts of the state and other communities because there's a tremendous amount of private funds out there. Okay. I mean, the government is just limited in terms of what they have and their resources. But if developers can get a fair return and, the state no longer, has a responsibility of, trying to maintain these buildings because now they're being managed by, the private developer. However, the residents have all the same rights as a public housing residence because they remain a public housing residence for the 99-year lease. And then it all reverts back to the housing authority. So this is an innovative, and that's what we need to do, is look at innovative programs that can serve poor people and, some of the people that do have these funds, that they can get a fair return and do something good at the same time to help the population. So we're looking at doing innovative things. One additional thing, we also had a competitive grant that we got from Department of Housing and Community Development to renovate one of our elderly buildings. It's 56 units of senior housing. We're doing them totally over, new kitchens, baths, outside space, the whole 9 yards. And this will, in exchange, we will make sure that we're building space so that we can have counseling to allow people to age in place. I mentioned that number earlier about what it really costs to move someone into assisted living. So if we can provide them with more services to age in place, again, that's going to lower the overall cost for the state. And in exchange, they're going to give us the money that we need to, make sure that we can bring the building up to par and have the space to be able to provide additional supportive services to people while they're in place.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we've reached our time. I just want to reiterate again how much I appreciate you guys helping us frame this discussion and engage in it in a way that didn't shy away from the challenges. You guys definitely presented us with so many of the challenges that exist in the area of housing justice, but you also gave us so much of the hope that exists as well, which we talked about in our discussion before we started, that you guys are it. There's people engaging in such good work. There's organizations that are doing innovative and creative things, and just with so much knowledge, expertise, and creativity. So I'm thankful that you brought us both of those things, that we can a little bit understand better the challenges that are there, and also hopefully be able to partner with and support some of the organizations doing the good work. One BFJN friend has been posting a lot of the links and organizations that you guys have shared in the chat. And so hopefully people can connect with those and explore a little bit more and learn a little bit more, because as we talked about, one of our goals is to help people engage further. This is a start. Housing is such a big topic that what we really wanted to do is give people an entryway so that we can begin a conversation and create people who are curious to learn more and to become doers of justice in this really, really important area. So I invite people to click those links and keep engaging with all of that, and connect with Boston Faith and Justice on Facebook and on our website, and we will keep this discussion going. So thank you all so much for giving of your time, your expertise, your experience, and sharing your stories. I'm thankful for each one of you being with us tonight. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you for inviting me.
Elizabeth, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.